Hi, and thank you all for joining me today. I have a guest with me today. This is interview number 7 in the Color of Racism series. Today I have Lacey Lewis with me from Indigenous Child Service Management Limited, or ICSM. Lacey's personal and professional interests are one in the same: love, passion, and commitment to her family, community is how she engages with her work. She does so in the social service sector, specializing in Indigenous children and youth matters. Her personal achievements are reflective of her children's well-being. When they succeed as a parent, she achieves. On the professional achievement aspect, she's proud to be behind the creation, design, and implementation of an Indigenous dispute resolution program. Excuse me, a designated chartered mediator, co-founder of Indigenous Child Service Management Limited, focusing on child advocacy, consulting, service management, training, education, and Indigenous mediation. ICMS services southwestern regions of Ontario, so including Niagara, Hamilton, Halton, and Waterloo. It was incorporated in February of 2016, and their mission is providing each individual with the ability to choose conscious rising. I love that. All children have the right to be safe, respected, and valued. Our children should be given every opportunity to self-identify when being protected. So by our, I mean Native children, Indigenous children. Our children are sacred gifts and we must take responsibility. I so believe in that. ICSM is the first off-reserve Indigenous Child Advocate Office. Advocates are individuals with backgrounds in the social service sector, child welfare, criminal, restorative justice, educators, and healthcare. Advocates carry legal and cultural knowledge to support and represent Indigenous children and youth at risk or in the care of Children's Aid Society. The purpose of an advocate is to ensure a voice and a choice for the children and youth when it comes to their unique life situations. So thank you so much, Lacey, for agreeing to be on the series today. And I am just going to hand it over to you and let you take the lead.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And for all your audience members, I would just like to say thank you to them as well for, doing what they do in terms of opening their minds and their hearts, because, what we do with Indigenous Child Service Management is very, very important, because what's good for Native children is good for all children. And I really want to emphasize that. Indigenous Child Service Management, yes, started in 2016. However, like any small business or medium-sized business, or SME, as I've heard recently, which I just love that word, it didn't just really start in 2016. It does go back. I'm not going to go back centuries, but I am going to go back a little bit with respects to starting with RCAP. So RCAP was the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in 2016. And that component, in terms of where ICSM lies, was there was many recommendations that were made. And I would encourage your followers to definitely take a peek at it. Once it was completed, unfortunately, it sat on a shelf, like many other commissioned reports for Indigenous peoples. But what's important from that is in 2005, 2006, Dr. Cindy Blackstock came to the region of Niagara in Niagara Falls, and she did a conference on the touchstones of hope. And without going into too much detail, because we could definitely be here for a week, she really was trying to educate all peoples, specifically child welfare sector, in regards of saying you must think differently when it comes to serving Indigenous children. It's not by accident or mistake. Children who are First Nation are of higher proportion in child welfare's care. So for example, at the height of residential school, give or take approximately 150,000 Indigenous children, First Nation children, were in government systems of care. Taking that and fast forwarding it to the realities of today, it's approximately between 20, 30% of First Nations children are in CAS's care. So out of their 100% of children that they would service in care, 20, 25%, 30%, it really depends on the geographical location. And that's why you kind of had a little bit of a pause from me, is it really depends on the location of how many children are in care. But to lay that in context, what that really means is if 4% of Indigenous children are the population of Ontario, yet 20 to 30% represent children in care, that demonstrates the fragility of our office and what we do, because our goal is prevention and crisis mitigation. Our goal is not to have children taken from the homes, but to be kept in their homes and provided services that will really highlight the need to support our parents. And what I mean by that is through Dr. Cindy Blackstock and her Touchstones of Hope, she has a lot of different modules. But the one that's really important is really looking at structural intervention from a child welfare perspective, from an administrator role. It's really about how do you dismantle this system that has been built up so large that they can't get out of it. It's like they've dug this hole.
I have a question, if I can interject there for a minute. So is part of the issue today that it's cyclical, and because there was such a large number of children many years ago put in the system, that just cycles through generation after generation?
That's correct. It's being repetitive in that nature. And so what's happening within those structural barriers is Dr. Blackstock, through that conference, was attempting to ensure that, CAS took that message, reached out. She provided, content, curriculum, resources, tools to help, non-Indigenous people, non-Indigenous CASs to better understand potentially how to restructure a system that, we would call the machine today. And so for better or worse, I do know that some CASs have attempted and or have done a best to do some type of modeling. It may not be hers, but have done their best. The reality is they failed and are continuing to fail, unfortunately. But to kind of bring it back home in terms of Dr. Blackstock and that effort, the other effort that I would just want to talk about in terms of ICSM and why and where we started from was really to go into that Dr. Blackstock realized that there was significant discrimination against First Nation children compared to all other children. And that begs the question of why. Why are First Nation children's worth less than every other child? And so I'm going to bring up a very special kiddo to me in my heart, because really Jordan River Anderson, who is First Nation from Norway House, Cree First Nation, spent his entire life living in a hospital. Jordan River Anderson, had lots of complex needs, like some children. They're born with complex needs. It's nobody's fault. It is. And so after him getting an amount of wonderful care at the hospital he was at, and about 2.5 years in, he was okay to go home. Unfortunately, between the provincial government and the federal government, they couldn't decide who was responsible for paying for Jordan's care. So what that really means, Helen, is if yourself or myself, and yes, I'm First Nation, was to have a child, I don't live on reserve, for example. So because I don't live on reserve, it wouldn't matter if my child needed medical care, it would receive it.
Right.
Just like if you had your child and it needed medical care, it would receive it. So what type of medical care are we talking about? It could be something as significant as, kids with breathing tubes or feeding tubes. I don't know anything about that. I'm not sure how much experienced you are in that. That's what a medical professional would need to come in and do and teach the parent. So yes, the parent could help, but also you need a medical professional in there on a regular basis because of those medical needs. And because of that, the federal government has a legal responsibility to Indigenous peoples like Jordan. They didn't want to cover the cost because Jordan was in a provincial jurisdiction in a provincial hospital. Therefore, the federal government is saying to the provincial government, he's not our responsibility, he's yours, he's in your jurisdiction. And the provincial government is saying, hold on, this kiddo lives on reserve. So when he leaves here, he's going to the reserve, so he's not our jurisdiction. That is very disappointing because I'm assuming all your viewers that are listening and those who may be first-time listeners, that is what created Jordan's principle. Was Dr. Blackstock had enough of this abuse and atrocity for children, not First Nation children, but children. And so with that being said, she went to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. She got a lot of support from a lot of Indigenous agencies, including the Assembly of First Nations, Niskayaski Nation, and a few others. And away they went. After a decade of the government fighting First Nations children, Dr. Blackstock won her case that the government is willfully and recklessly discriminating against First Nations children. And so for us in our office today, because of all her effort and time and commitment to ensuring First Nations children have a fair chance of health, equality, and to reduce and eliminate substantive inequality, are really key components in terms of ICSM, in terms that, our vision is we need to put all children first. But I go back to that statement at the beginning of saying what's good for First Nation children is good for all children. Because if we can eliminate poverty, neglect, and discrimination for First Nations children, then we've done our job for all children. And so with that being said, and with ICSM and Jordan's principle and kind of laying those pieces out, what I can share with you is that for us, our advocacy component is paramount to what we do, because some children are placed in situations where absolutely, there might be a need of protection and there might be a need of duty to report. However, for us, our fundamental principle, first and foremost, is that it's a duty to care. So before you need to report to somebody, you need to care about what the actual issue is. And why I say that is sometimes, child welfare punishes those for being honest and truthful.
Agree.
And if you find a social worker out there that disputes that, then I don't think they should be a social worker. And the reason why I say that is if you have a child, for example, let's say a teenager, because I think there's many people that have teens and they've been a teen. If they don't have any teens, they've been a teen. And, it gets heated sometimes between parents. And if you're, a single parent and you've kind of gone through life's wheel a couple of times where maybe you've had one or two different partners and unfortunately they've ended in domestic violence situations or unhealthy situations where, there was a separation needed. Typically for children, absolutely, they feel torn at times between loving both parents, but only staying with one. And in those cases, sometimes if it's domestic violence, children come into care because of the domestic violence and the protection, and to decide what parent is the better suited parent, that's really difficult. And on top of that, let's just say, again, when I go back to the teenager component of it, is that, if heated arguments happened between daughter and mother or father and son, and now there's a physical altercation, no one needed medical care in terms of hospital, but, people slapped, people scratched, people yelled, whatever, you tussled around on the ground. Does that warrant that child wants their parent arrested? That's a very slippery slope. However, that is something that a child welfare protection worker potentially will ask the child. And sometimes they don't, they just go ahead and call the police. And that will have a significant ripple effect for that child, that parent, and that family. And I know the topic is about racism and discrimination, and these are those components, because now you have a child welfare system that has imposed on the child that they need to lay charges. Now you have a police system involved that will lay charges and impose what? Some type of court restriction and order that they have to follow. And it just keeps layering on and layering on, layering on. So for us as advocates, our goal really is to say to that child, you have a voice and choice. What happened? You know, it's not, if it's something that absolutely is repeated, then it's warranted. However, if this is a one-time off, or you know what, maybe parents have got heated before with teenagers, and sometimes, you know what, teenagers can get in parents' faces. And so we understand that, and it's our duty to care. And it's our duty to hear their voice and choice that, you know what, they don't want to stay with mom or dad. They want to go to the other parent, for example. Maybe that is the best solution for a short period of time. And that's okay. Because I find with a lot of youth that either report to some of our staff or to myself directly, because I've been involved in some cases, where they're saying, I want to be with the other parent for now, but I still want to go back home. And if there was a charge that was laid, it changes the whole dynamic of everything. And that's really part of the harm that is created because of a system that was set up as a two-tiered system. Those who are the haves and those who are the have-nots.
That's what I was sitting here thinking, privilege versus no privilege, when I was listening to you talk. And again, that's in CAS across the board, right? Not just with Indigenous children, but it's blown up with Indigenous children because the rates of kids in care is so much higher.
Correct. And just a sidebar, in terms of incarcerations for men and women that are Indigenous, it actually hasn't gone down over the years, it's increased. And specifically for Indigenous women, they represent 37% of the population. Where do you think our children are going?
Yeah.
So that's quite significant. But just really quickly, I just wanted to plug in there that in terms of our advocacy component, we do have other services that we offer because our goal is prevention. And so we have what we call our Traditional Knowledge Keeper program, which is actually built upon Dr. Blackstock's Touchstones of Hope within Truth, Acknowledge, Restore, Repair. She has a whole curriculum model of that. And so we really try and build on that with our children in terms of their outcomes and parents' outcomes. And so we do that. We have elder services that we provide both, spiritual and traditional ways of knowing. And again, we also have Indigenous approaches to dispute resolution. And so that's a little bit about ICSM, what we do, and kind of an example of, a way that we try and really work with the family and keeping them together versus utilizing child welfare as a tool sometimes that will end up punishing the family versus healing the family.
And I am such a believer in children having their own voice. Just because they're younger or shorter does not mean they don't know their own mind, does not mean they don't know their own heart and what is best for them. And we so often don't give them the opportunity to use that voice. So I love that you advocate in that way. I think we need more of that worldwide.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I'm hoping to kind of jump ship on ICSM for a minute. And I definitely wanted to talk about how I spoke about some of these components to kind of jump to the beginning of where racism got down to the nitty-gritty with First Nations peoples. And I'd say it did start before the Indian Act, but I'm going to start around the time of the Indian Act of 1876. And the reason for that is I must make all those aware that the Indian Act is the only legislation in planet Earth that has legislation for a specific race. Meaning in Africa, they don't have legislation for certain Africans, or in Asia, China doesn't have specific legislation for the Japanese. But yet in Canada, there's the Indian Act that is specifically for First Nations peoples of what they can and cannot do. And so what's really important about that is when the act actually started, and I do have a paper here that I wanted to just read something off so it's very specific, is that when the Indian Act first started out, their goal was assimilation, but how they did it was in small pockets that went over time. But their very first attempt at creating criteria for who is First Nation and who is not is quite significant. So just to share with you, the first attempt of defining Indians was actually prior to the Indian Act, which was in 1850, which was 17 years before the Indian Act actually came about and was created as legislation, which it was, the definition was to be inclusive, which was any person of Indian birth or blood, any person that reputed to belong to a particular group of Indians, and any person to marry in or adopt into an Indian family. So those pieces you could actually find in a lot of different types of reports, articles, and stuff. But I just wanted to grab that segment there, because when you're talking about racism, there in itself is a colonial system already oppressing Indigenous peoples by suggesting how they can be or they can't be
Indigenous, right?
Indigenous. And so when you have that going back that far, there's two pieces within the Indian Act that are very important, which is a section 6.1 and a section 6.2. 6.1 says, hey, you're full blood First Nation, you're full status. A 6.2 is, well, you have mixed blood with your First Nation, so you're a 6.2. But the goal with the First Nation and the goal with the tiered system of criteria of status or non-status in itself was a way to colonize or train First Nations people to say, if you don't stay within your own race, then you're not that race. And so those pieces, you know, are very troubling, absolutely. But when you're looking at those pieces, it really is, you know, going back to the government's way of whitewashing, right? Because you have to kill the Indian to save the child type of mentality. And so because of those pieces, because of the history of the Indian Act, it's still relevant today. And why is it still relevant today? Well, there's two critical cases that I would bring forward in terms of the history of how racism started, identity, criteria, to today is, I think it was 2014, 2015, the Daniels case, where the Supreme Court had issued to suggest that non-status and Métis are Indian peoples. Now that opens up a huge other argument and case within Indigenous peoples itself, because what does that mean for those that are treaty, like First Nations people that are treaty, compared to a First Nation non-status? And I know I'm throwing a lot of stuff out there. I hope to tease it out as we continue, but that is really the crux of it. Because for those that are First Nation status, who have treaty, who have sovereign rights, who have those components versus those who are non-status, what does that mean?
Right.
And the second component to that is Native Women's of Canada also have taken the government to court to where absolutely S3 has come out of their fight. And what S3 is it allows for those who are non-status but are actually eligible for status to be how do I say, repatriated.
Ah, okay.
So if I was to kind of unwind this tangled web of what I just shared with you, my example or my story would be as such. If you have a First Nation plus a First Nation, you get a First Nation. So that's a 6.1. I'm sorry. Now, if you have a First Nation plus a non-First Nation, you have a child, it's a 6.2. Now that 6.2, who's half First Nation and non-First Nation, has a child with somebody else who's non-First Nation, they have a child, that child is not entitled to be identified as First Nation because of the discrimination of the criteria that was built in the Indian Act.
Right.
But remember, First Nation equals a First Nation. A First Nation and a non-First Nation, depending, can be a 6.2. Now let's say that 6.2 lives on reserve and has a child with a non-Native, but that child lives on reserve, but they're not qualified? What? How did that happen? And typically how that happened was really First Nation women marrying non-Native men and franchised them. So with Bill C-31 and not Bill, but C-31 and C-3, those were components of the act that through the Supreme Court in 1985, I believe, had rectified those wrongs of the discrimination to allow our mothers, our grandmothers to be grandfathered back in after all of that had been undone, meaning that because they married, they're no longer First Nation. Well, after 85 and the ruling says, no, this is wrong, we need to correct this, you can go back 2 generations. But the reality is, Helen, it was still wrong.
Right.
So S3 really opens that door to allow more children that actually should be acknowledged as First Nations to be acknowledged as First Nations, because it's not their fault that they were discriminated because of legislation that they had nothing to do with.
And so it seems on the surface that that was a good thing, that they went back and they rectified the wrong, but it's still, as you said, it's still wrong because it only went back 2 generations, and there are still the possibilities that, okay, those that live on reserve now may qualify, but those who live off the reserve may still not qualify, even though they have the same lineage. Is that correct?
Yeah, like the same type of criteria and windows. It discriminates against women specifically because when women have children, the children became non-status because of those pieces. But if it was the man, or the man was to marry a non-Indigenous woman, that non-Indigenous woman is now entitled to status, and all of her kin are. And
so
yet,
a white woman could end up qualifying for status, and an Indigenous woman could end up through marriage not qualifying for status, and then all of her descendants would not qualify.
correct.
And this is a systemic problem with women, right?
Correct. And I think the other point that I wanted to make was that for Indigenous women, when going back traditionally speaking, for Indigenous women, we were a matriarchy of a society, not a patriarchy. And so the government got that wrong out of the gate when they were coming over here.
Right, because they did it from their perspective.
Correct. And the reality is women were kind of the stewards of the community, where when colonization and settlers came in, they went to the men to confer and consult. And so that in itself was really, partly a genocide to all women who continued to birth the children. And now their children are no longer, safe, welcome, on reserve, because technically they married out. And back in that time, if you married out, you were booted off the reserve. So that's where, some of those pieces come from in terms of identity, racism, discrimination,
So that part has still not been rectified.
No, it's still not rectified. I can definitely say that S3 is very recent. I think that decision came down in 2018. So it's still freshly drying. So really in terms of amendments or parents, bans, really pushing for certain children to have their status reclaimed under an S3 category. I still think the governments and the bans and everybody is still trying to figure that out, because there's just been so many court rulings in favor of Indigenous people, because judges are seeing it, lawyers are seeing it. I really do believe that between Idle No More and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission have highlighted this for a lot of people to truly understand that we're not trying to, quote, get kickbacks or trying to find, the quick buck or anything. Like, it's not about that. It's really about, sharing the information to say, hey, were you aware of these things? Because this is what's, this is our reality. These are our lived realities of what's going on. It's not by mistake that, 20 and 30% of First Nation children are in CAS's care. It's not by mistake 37% of Indigenous women are in the correctional institutions. And, again, outside of Indigenous, I do want to also just quickly highlight also the numbers of Black individuals, whether it be for police brutality, institutionalization in CASs, or correctional facilities, because it's quite high as well for those numbers, and it's very disproportionate as well.
Thank you for adding that in. Yeah, because I think so many people just don't understand the disproportionate numbers, right? And how that came to be, and how that it is systemic and continues on, because of that systemic underlying issue that happened many years ago, right? And that's the thing I would like to just say here in this series. What I get from this is just bringing awareness to myself, learning, sharing that with my community, and I so appreciate all the guests that come on and will speak and tell stories and share with us from the heart, because we don't know what we don't know, and until someone can say it in a way that we can really relate to that personally, it just doesn't sit with you the same. And I don't think that necessarily makes us bad people. We just don't know what we don't know. My other point is, once somebody gives us that information, it's no longer that we don't know. And that's when we choose to continue on being racist, or to change our behavior and work towards being anti-racist. So I just want to say that I do so appreciate all the guests that come on, and I in no way feel like an expert in this. I feel I'm so naive, and that's what started this whole series, is my own wish to do better.
Sure, because when we know better, we do better.
Absolutely. And so I just want to say thank you, because I sit here and we chatted before a couple of times, and I'm just gobsmacked, sort of, at how much I do not know. I've lived in Canada my whole entire life. I live in small town Ontario where there's not a lot of cultural diversity, and it's not okay to insulate ourselves. We are a global society now, and we need to open up our own minds and really listen to people and really figure out what all this disparity is about and how it came about and how we can be part of the solution and not continue on being part of the problem. So I'll give it back to you. That was just, I really wanted to share that because it's just so much of what I hear in these interviews. I can't even fathom. So
No, no, yeah, no, I understand. And I really do want to take the opportunity because, silence sometimes is accepting of behavior. And I needed to hear that for many years because truthfully, I'm more of a, records keeper, keep quiet. I think that pen to paper and sending things out, can and does make a difference. But sometimes if you don't voice it out there, then there are people you're not reaching. And I think that, maybe it's a little bit of age too, that is kind of said, you know what, you gotta get out there. Because if not, you're allowing people to keep their foot on your neck.
Mm.
And with that being said, between talking a little bit about ICSM and talking a little bit about statistical numbers and the Indian Act and those pieces, what's really kind of evolved through that whole process is starting with residential schools, and then the 60 scoop, and then the millennium scoop, and then we're still living it today. And when you look at those pieces, and I'll try and jump in a little bit on each of those pieces, what I also would want to highlight through those things. So the residential school system really is anywhere between 1850 and the last residential school closed was 1996.
I had no idea it was that recent. I was just like dumbfounded.
Yeah. And so within that whole confine, the piece of saying, the 60 scoop, some people believe it's, that happened during the 60s. No, it actually started a little bit earlier on in about 1952, 1954, and it really extends to about 1981, 82. So the 60 scoop really isn't about people that were just born in the 60s. There's a larger group of that cohort. So I think I would probably start, like, in terms of the residential school systems, for those that don't know, it was a way of taking the children from the reserves and educating them and providing them with life skills because they don't know how to hunt or fish or feed themselves for many centuries before settlers came. I was being a little bit facetious there. And so because of the residential schools, our children were taken from their reserves. They were stripped really of understanding their land-based teachings. They were stripped of their language. They were stripped of their ceremonies. And when they went into these schools or missions, they were beaten. Literally, they were beaten for speaking their language. Some were beaten for crying because they missed their parents. Some were experimented on. No joke. Some were experimented on because obviously during that time, the wars had ended, but there was still famine and things like that. Well, what better guinea pigs than children who can't tell their parents what's happening? But I think the most disturbing absolutely was the sexual abuse that went on, and the deaths that took place. The children that ran away trying to find their way home and dying in a field, dying on the train tracks or nearby because they didn't want to be there anymore, or they didn't feel welcome. Because residential school was pitched to the elders and the parents as something good and wonderful, and it wasn't. So I'll leave that residential school part there because there's lots of information out there. And then I would just like to jump into the 60 scoop a little bit, which really was no better. What happened is that between the residential school systems and child welfare, how child welfare actually became or came about, it actually started with the Humane Society and animals back in the late 1800s. And so through that, there was a case for a child that absolutely needed the protection. And, here we go, we have child welfare. But what happened was, remember how I shared about, the Indian Act, and then I shared about Jordan's principle, and I talked about the federal jurisdiction and provincial jurisdiction? Well, that's what really happened with residential schools and then the 60s scoop. What happened was the federal government really gave the provincial government authority, without consulting with First Nations, which they should have, about that. And what happened was, in 1952, the provincial government placed a component within the Child Welfare Act to suggest that any property, meaning any children, could be removed. And thus started the 60 scoop. And I have some elders, I have some, faith keepers and knowledge holders that actually have what are called catalogs. And for those that remember Sears catalogs or Canadian Tire catalogs, there was catalogs for First Nations children. So if you wanted to purchase a cute little Indian boy or girl, look through the catalog, look at their photo, look at what they'd like to do and not like to do, because they needed saving from their reserve and their parents. But truthfully, they were stolen. They were stolen. And so there is catalogs that do exist. These are part of Canada's history that some absolutely are willing to talk about, acknowledge, and move towards healing in a good way. But there's also a lot out there, a lot of people out there too, that either say, get over it, that happened way back when, and or, well, that's not how life is today. I would absolutely beg to differ. And if we wanted to get into a bigger debate about child welfare and concrete components of how apprehensions happen and concrete components of what are the subtopics of how the apprehensions happen, that could be for another day. But what I can say to you through that 60s scoop, absolutely, it was really residential school all over again, but now it's justified because there's provincial legislation to do such. And so from that, we have the Millennium Scoop. So the Millennium Scoop is really the same thing that happened in the 60s Scoop happening in the millennia. However, what happened during the Millennium Scoop is, as I shared at the beginning, Jordan's principle. So there was things and movements that had taken place because of RCAP. And because of a few Supreme Court rulings, one back in '85, which was about Indigenous women being repatriated. And then again in 1990, where bands were now, and CAS has had a legal obligation to let bands know, oh yeah, here's a kicker for you, that in 1990, bands were finally given the right to know that when their children were adopted, they would be notified. Before that, bands weren't even notified what happened to the kids. So when you talk about government statistics and statistical data, look, you got to throw it out.
And as a mother, how, like, I can't even imagine, like, how horrifying, A, that they were taken, but B, that you don't even know they're safe or where they're going or how they're treated or if somebody loves them.
And these are children that sometimes they could have been with their parents till 3, 4. They remember, they know that they came from somewhere else. But what happens is children end up with these identity fractures. And these identity fractures are, they could have had the best parents in the world. And I mean that because for people to open up their hearts, their homes to any child of any age is so commendable and just so forthright of giving, that there are children that do need safe places, and not just First Nation children, all children need safe places. And so for those foster parents who potentially, sometimes some foster parents only want to foster, and those ones, for me, sometimes I do question, um, their intent, because we all know with fostering, there's money that's put behind that to support the child, which it should be. However, there's other nitty gritty pieces that I'm just not going to get into right now, but that's where I'd question the intent versus some people who foster and then they fall in love with the kids and now they want to adopt. There's a difference between falling in love with the kids and adopting because there is nobody, and falling in love and adopting because that's what you want versus helping that child to go home.
Yeah. And also like just the sheer rational thought that, I mean, where does racism come from, right? The thought whenever this was all created that our way is the best way and that we should have control over someone else as a government, as a people, you know, like that's just, you know, that the Indian way of life is not acceptable. It has to be the colonial way of life. And that we're doing a favor for these Indigenous children by raising them the white way. Like that's just so arrogant.
Yeah, I mean, you know, going back to the, you know, 17th century, 18th century, 19th century, you know, we were for some parts of those times absolutely very independent and revered and respected. But, you know, there came a point in time in terms of that colonization that it was, you know, we were childlike.
Mm-hmm.
An adult was childlike because they lit a fire and were dancing around a fire, not understanding that we were honoring, maybe it was a sunrise ceremony, for example. So maybe they were honoring the land, the sun, everything that has been given to us. And I'm talking before there's grocery stores, right? Like I'm talking like hunting, like that's how you received
When
your
you live
source.
from the land.
Correct. And you know, that all of a sudden became devil worshiping, right? So, oh, they're childlike. They don't know how to parent. Well, we were here way before you were, and we're still here today, thankfully, because we did have strong elders and strong aunties and uncles in the community that either did things in secret to make sure that it got passed down from one generation to the next. And also for those that stood up and were okay and knew potentially that they were going to die because they did speak up, but they couldn't live by staying silent either. But to kind of go through, you know, the residential school, the 60s scoop, the millennium scoop, and up until today, I mean, I do believe some child welfare agencies are waking up. Like they're really waking up and trying to figure out how to do things differently. And in addition to that, you know, in 2006, there was legislation within the Child Youth Service Act, sorry, because now it's called the Child Family Service Act, which is now called the Child Youth and Family Service Act. Sorry, I said that backwards. But what happened is there was legislation put in there, and back then it was called Part 10, because everything in law is New Roman. And so Part 10 was for Native children specifically, because there was certain rights that needed to be honored and respected. So as I shared about 1990 and bands finally getting the right to know when children were being adopted out, comes 2006, legislation getting revamped, there was a specific section now for Native children. And with those specific section lied certain rights. However, some of those rights absolutely were still infringed upon because a lot of child welfare would argue the best interest of the child, the best interest of the child. But when you really look at the best interest of the child, the question becomes the best interest to whom? Right? And when we're looking at the best interest to whom is who has the power to suggest it's the best interest? The legislation. the policy structure within child welfare, which that's what you can call structural racism. Structural racism is about policies and procedures, internal drivers to set the choice of what is a policy or a procedure. And so when you look at that and you look at structural racism, going back to Dr. Blackstock, her conference, and really dismantling what the child welfare system is and restructuring structural interventions so that it is on the premise of, you know, healing and wellness, and it is on the premise of looking from a cultural lens, a worldview lens versus a Eurocentric lens, an individual lens, right? So there's a lot of those components that you know would need to be unpacked. But I think that, you know, the biggest pieces within residential schooling system, the 60s scoop and the millennium scoop and up until today, is there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. There is some good work out there, but there still is a lot of racism and a lot of truth that needs to be reconciled. But it's not Indigenous people that need to do the reconcile. It's really the non-Indigenous people that need to do the reconcile. But we're there to help support along the way. Yeah.
Yeah, and if you can share with the audience what we talked about too, is that discrepancy in the worth, I'll say, for lack of a better term, of Indigenous children versus off reserve children of whatever race it may be, and how that plays out in today's world, as well as, you know, leading up to today.
Yeah, so I think that if we were to talk, for example, in general, in terms of social work and stuff like that, and I know I'm pushing a lot of Dr. Blackstock's components, but the truth is there's a lot of stuff happening right now. So I really do want a lot of people to take a look at her work, but also Dr. Cynthia Wesley Exquimah is somebody else. Please look into her work. Maria Batiste, please look into her work. These are amazing, amazing women. As much as I would mention some men, truthfully, I can't think of any off the top of my head in terms of the scholar and academic components of it, because I know a lot of people are evidence-based, and that's okay. So that's why I'm trying to give a name drop some evidence-based individuals. But when we're talking about it, like when we look at our history from a First Nations perspective, a lot of our ancestors were mostly right with what we were doing, versus when we look at non-Indigenous peoples and we look at their ancestry, they've been wrong. Hence the Indian Act, hence colonization. You know, when we look at a subject or a topic or a feeling, you know, from an Indigenous lens, you know, it's multidimensional. We know that. But from non-Indigenous or mainstream lens, everything was one dimension until science was able to prove through the physics that there is multiple dimensions. Right. So it's like, okay, thank you for validating again. You know, and I think where we start off as Indigenous people is a place of abundance. We don't look at what we don't have. We look at what we have and how we can build on that. Where sometimes for non-Indigenous lens, it's a scarcity right out the gate. Yeah. And so when we look at those pieces of you know, social work, and we look at those pieces in terms of Indigenous lens versus a non-Indigenous lens, and then we talk about the value of children and the value of the cost of a child, it really comes down to when Dr. Blackstock had won her ruling. I believe it was that First Nation children's value was approximately 68 or 69 cents on the dollar. For children who are off reserve, you're looking at, you know, 93 cents to a full dollar's value. Why? Why? There wasn't an incentive for First Nations to be caring for their own children because they weren't given the funding. They weren't given the funding for it, meaning non-CASs would apprehend the children. They would go into non-CAS's care, non-Indigenous homes, be stripped from all their culture. It's the same thing like residential school, but it's legal.
Right.
It's legal, it's valid, all that type of good stuff. And so because of those pieces, you know, when you're looking at sustainable needs for children, First Nations children's needs are going to be tremendously different than non-Indigenous children's needs. And one of the big things, just quite simply, is if a child's coming into care from a northern community, for example, and maybe a CAS doesn't have a placement for them in that area, they might need to be flown somewhere. What's that cost? And then the cost of caring for that child for a year. What if we were to reverse that and say to the parent, we're going to invest in you, in your home, in your house, and we're going to help you parent. Because remember, a lot of our moms and grandmothers are products of the system themselves. And if they're products of the systems themselves, and they didn't really receive hugs and kisses and financial skills in terms of what's a credit score and those types of things, then, you know, some people would argue to say, was the system any better for those children who are now parenting, but they're actually not parenting because we're apprehending due to your history. So we would argue, well, whose history is that? Because if you were the parent of that child, shouldn't we be taking a closer examination of what went wrong within the system because you were the parent? You know, a lot of child welfare individuals snubbed those statements early on in my career of working, where now I could probably say about 50% understand that and get that. The other 50%, I think, are, yeah, well, what other option do we have right now? And unfortunately,
there's always options if you look for them, right?
Absolutely. I don't have time for problems, but I got time for solutions.
Yeah. But you have to have that forward thinking if you're ever going to get there.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, if we just stay status quo, then we're always there.
Yes.
One of my favorite statements is, if you're not growing, you are in fact dying.
There you go. That's a good one.
There's no standing still, right? That's not how life works.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I can say that what has happened and what has transformed is that there was the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action that came through. That was one thing. And within the Truth and Reconciliation and the calls to action, you also have the very top 5 calls to actions. They're not really recommendations, calls to actions. The top 5 calls to actions are all child welfare driven, all of them. That's how significant, when you're talking about racism, regardless of whatever type it is, whether it's the colorblind racism or the symbolic racism or the social exclusion or the structural racism, it doesn't matter. It did start from the Indian Act. I mean, there could be stuff that you can argue before that, but I really do start there because that's where you actually have evidence.
Right.
So when we're talking about evidence and evidence informed, look at the Indian Act. It trickles into residential school, which trickles into the 60s scoop, that trickles into the Millennium scoop, that trickled into the TRC. And now when we're talking about the TRC, child welfare absolutely is going through a transformation. It is painstakingly slow, though I appreciate all parties' best efforts. What has happened is that child welfare itself, in terms of non-CASs, are starting to, and really they're kind of forced or have to, allow First Nations organizations and agencies to take ownership of our own children, which we should be. Sorry, I think I'm looking a little bit more on the darker side. Does that help a little bit? I don't know.
A little bit, yep.
A little bit, okay. Or maybe it's just me in my eyes, I don't know. But because of those pieces, we need to be taking care of our own children. You know, it doesn't mean that we can't share the space, but we need to have the opportunity, and we must be providing the service. Because when you have non-Indigenous peoples going in to provide services to Native children, it's based on their lens and their views. And, you know, sometimes you hear, oh, well, I got a teaching from this person, or I had a workshop, or I did 2 years of education. That's great. And I honor that, and I honor that space. But if you're making a talking stick with a family that culturally doesn't use talking sticks, you're actually doing more harm to that family, even though your heart had good intention. It created more harm. Or if you chose to bring medicines. So for some of us First Nations peoples, yes, we use medicines like sage, like cedar, what have you. Yes, we burn it. Yes, we utilize that as part of ceremony or ritual cleansing. That's fine. But there are First Nations that do not. And if you're doing it with those that do not, again, you shouldn't be doing it, because it's
Right,
not
that's again imposing our way as the right way, even when we're trying to say, oh, this is the way Indigenous people do it. But again, our arrogance supersedes the ignorance, and rather than asking, we impose. Right?
Correct. And so when we're looking at all those things, you know, those are the pieces that I think really frustrate a lot of our community members, and or, you know, promises of, oh, we can do this, or we can get you this, or we can get you that. But when it really comes down to the brass tacks, it's either non-Indigenous people creating Indigenous content, which is totally wrong. And for anybody I come across and I find that, I'll call them out on it. Most of the time I'll say it privately, but I'd probably say the last couple of years anyways, I don't even do that anymore, just because when you do that, you pacify them.
Right.
And they continue anyways. Or what I've learned is sometimes those individuals, they're not in really decision-making roles or have executive roles to negotiate. They are just, for lack of a better word, part of that assembly line.
Right.
So sometimes you can call them out on it, but it's not even them, it's somebody who's superior. So it's important that sometimes if you have that space to call them out, just call them out, say it straightforward, so then they can take it back, and then they can go and consult internally and figure out what they're doing. Because maybe what I've noticed, or another community member's noticed, or another community organization has noticed, to say, hey, that's not okay. You actually need to have us get involved. And that really comes back to, you know, when we're talking about the racism component, again, when I come back to symbolic racism, like people's behavior changes. So as I shared with you, you know, I used to actually talk to people separate and apart and say, hey, you know, I really do appreciate everything that you're doing. And I totally get, you know, yes, I know you're, you know, your child welfare, or you're in this section or that section of child welfare. But in terms of, say, cultural planning, so for Indigenous children, they can have a cultural plan. So let's say they do find their forever home, which is a good thing. For those that absolutely don't have family or kin, and can find some permanency and stability and structure, which is great. The problem is, though, is sometimes it's non-Indigenous child welfare workers creating cultural plans. Or sometimes we do have, you know, Native community agencies that have a lot of wonderful service and programs to offer. But when you're talking about an actual cultural agreement, you better know what you're talking about, because you're asking for non-Indigenous people to sign on the dotted line that they are going to do these things for this child who is First Nation. And sometimes that can be dangerous. And what I mean by that is if they're signing on the line and they're saying, yes, we're going to make sure this child gets all its ceremonies, it has a naming ceremony, it has its color ceremony, and then they go and take them to the reserve and the band's like, what are you doing here?
Right.
Well, I had this cultural agreement. But yet sometimes bands aren't even consulted, or unfortunately, sometimes bands are found in default. And I want to highlight what that really means. That means that First Nations bands have limited funds and resources to actually meet the needs of the children because of really the oppression of what they receive for monies, that maybe they could only really care for the actual community members themselves as a whole, and support in ways for children off reserve. However, it's on a very, very tight budget. So therefore, sometimes bands, they can't go to court every time. So if you have a band, let's just say in Southwestern Ontario, one of the 5 First Nations, so whether it's Munsee, Kettle Point, Walpole, and a child is in Toronto, is in Peel region, maybe they can come out there and maybe they can support them, but maybe they can't. Because 1, the back and forth in terms of travel and distance, but 2, how much of an impact could that band rep make for one child when they have over 100 children in need that are locally around their reserve, maybe in London or Kitchener or Cambridge or Windsor? How do you spread that out? So unfortunately, sometimes bands are found in default, but really not to no fault of their own.
Can I ask a question here just for clarification? So the band receives money for the community, but then out of that money, they're expected then to also provide services to off-reserve youth or children that may be adopted out or may be in foster care or may whatever that situation is, out of those funds provided for the community?
Not quite.
Okay.
So there's 2 components here. So when we're talking about bands, you have elected chief and council. When we talk about elected chief and council for some Indigenous people, or for most Indigenous people, will understand and or actually agree that they are bought and paid for by the government, because elected chief and council was created after Indian agents to govern Indigenous peoples, because Indian agents was absolutely oppressive, because an Indian agent are people that monitored Indigenous people on reserve. So that was X'd out, and instead you have chief and council. And so some, Indigenous people will say, well, they're just an extended arm of the crown. But I would have to argue and say, chief and council do amazing things for the communities, and they're doing their best. So in terms of funds, yes, funds go to chief and council for them in terms of maybe it's, and again, it depends on each band. So some bands are a little bit more resource rich.
Right. Okay.
So they have self-sustaining income coming in. Therefore, all their members get a fair share and shake. But when we're talking about funds, it's talking about registered members. So you can be a status Indian registered with INAC, but if your band doesn't believe you're a member or they don't acknowledge you, then they don't acknowledge you. So you see how you can have a disproportionate understanding of how the funds could potentially be allocated, because outside of talking about elected chief and council, you also have the hereditary. So hereditary chiefs, clan mothers, clan systems, those things still exist. And so there are large community members that either wish not to participate with chief and council because they're utilizing what's been there for centuries, which was the clan system and the hereditary system. So there's a lot of things that it could be very complex to decompartmentalize in terms of funding, but the long and short of it is, based on the membership or population that Chief and Council provide to the government or Statistics Canada, equates to X amount of dollars, plus maybe they've been fighting, which they are, for water. Maybe some reserves, it's not about water, it's about housing. For some reserve, maybe it's not about housing, but, you know, child welfare system itself. So there's a lot of pieces that go into that. The hard part is, in terms of the hereditary community and the hereditary clan system, they don't get funding from anybody. It's something that just is. So I think that I would say within the hereditary components, there's a lot of social enterprise and entrepreneurship that goes into those pieces to keep those components going, because again, some community members don't work with elected chief and council. They choose to still work within the traditional systems.
But this points to that structural racism too, that because these kids are now off reserve, they still deserve and need that cultural learning and upbringing from the people on reserve, and yet there's no funding for that.
That's correct. So
not enough funding.
Correct. So that's where really you do get, and this goes back to like the 60s and 70s of like the friendship movement, Native women's movement in agencies, the Métis Nation. So that's when we say urban. So for example, Indigenous Child Service Management is an urban off-reserve child advocate office. We're not looking to duplicate what band reps do. However, for children who are off reserve, and in some cases, as I shared with you, where a band may be in default, a child welfare agency has dollars for this First Nations child, but there's no Indigenous service provider to provide the specific service the child needs. That's where really we come in. This has been a system gap for a very long time. The difference being is, you know, for our office and for some Indigenous peoples, we're not really waiting for the government to take action. We're just doing it because we know it needs to be done. It's the right thing to do. And so that's really where, you know, well, where's the money going or what's really going on? The truth is the government doesn't know. So we're trying to do our best. I think First Nations and bands are absolutely trying to do their best to support all community members. And I think that, you know, in terms of CASs, those that are non-Indigenous CASs, they are trying to do their best in understanding all of these new court rulings, what their obligations are, what is appropriate to do, what's not appropriate to do. Because a good friend of mine said it's called being woke. And I think that there are some CASs that are waking up and really understanding. And when I say some CASs, I'm talking from a director or executive director's level. And I'm also talking from child welfare's board of directors levels that I believe it was in 2016, 2017, they made a commitment. It's called the Pathway Forward, I believe. And they made 9 commitments. And within those commitments, it's specific to Indigenous children, but the top one is to reduce the amount of Indigenous children coming into care, which is quite interesting because in terms of the child welfare and the TRC, one of their first recommendations is calling upon all the governments to commit to the Indigenous people and monitor and assess neglect investigations. So you're starting to see things align.
Yes.
But yet there's no power sharing between the dollars, meaning if you're child welfare, you have the dollars for the kids in care. Where child welfare sometimes struggles within that is cost. But I hope that they will start to understand racism costs money to get all the kids there. And it wasn't them, like them meaning directors or executives now. It's been happening since they were babies and before that.
And before that.
and
Yeah.
before that. But when they're trying to get the children out of care and get them back home, the problem becomes that if children needed specific services that were required, if they go home and they're not CAS's responsibility, CAS doesn't have dollars to afford that cost, which now it does one of two things. Either it gets flipped back to the parent, and if the parent potentially, maybe for the reason for apprehension again, maybe it was substance abuse or addictions. And I don't want to say all First Nations people get their children taken away because of substance abuse and addictions. There's a variety of things. And it's not just parents. Sometimes, again, it comes back to that systemic racism of that parent was a child in care. Well, because they chose to have a child at 19 or 20, it doesn't take much effort for a CAS to know, oh, this was a child that was in our care. So sometimes their file could be used against them. That's what I'm suggesting. But because of those things, if the children go back home, the CAS is stuck because it's like saying, well, what am I supposed to do?
Right. Because your hands are tied at that point.
You got it. And that's where really, our office is trying to come in and build that capacity within the 4 regions. And we hope to grow and expand upon that. But the reality is look, if children need additional supports and service and they go back home to the parent, I think that's where Dr. Blackstock was able to merge that system gap with Jordan's principle, because it is a child first initiative. And with it being a child first initiative, as I shared, the story about the provincial and federal governments fighting over who's going to be covering this child's care, with Jordan's principle, cover it and we'll figure out the rest later, because the clock's ticking on the kid. Yeah. So whether they have a clubbed foot or fibromyalgia or autism, if they're First Nations, cover the cost. And within, for example, say our office, CAS, the doctors, if there's other streams or ways to get services, we're more than willing to look at that. But until such time, can you cover the damn cost? Because you know what? The kiddo needed proper,
as you would for any other child.
Right. The kid needed proper shoes months ago or a year ago.
Yeah, let's be human and do the decent thing first and figure out where the funds come from later.
You got it. You got it. And so those are pieces that, I hope that, maybe with some of your audience, maybe I didn't even think about it till now, but maybe they're in social services. So I hope that they do see this and they do understand that that's really what, we're trying to do, is to try and continue to have a prevention model, but with crisis mitigation. And the crisis mitigation is that sometimes what you find with some social workers is they'll share with you that, I have some families that are really, really good and they don't need a lot of my attention. So I only visit them once every 30 days. And then a crisis occurs. Now the option is either in care or what are we doing here, or placing them with a family. And those are the pieces that sometimes drive workers nuts, because they work so hard, or the families have worked so hard, and because of a few oopses, now these children are placed in the same risk category as the high risk children that are already in care. So it's a tough service industry to be in. But it is worth it when the kids win, because when the kids win, then we all win.
And that is part of the problem, is that it is a industry. And yet, I mean, of course it has to be, because how else do you do that? But that in part and parcel is the problem, right? I mean, any institution comes with problems. You look at the school board, you look at the hospitals, you look at homes in the past for handicapped children, like you look at nursing homes, anything where there's a system can have issues within that system.
Absolutely. I mean, there's nothing perfect, and I am more of a believer, in terms of independence and kind of caring for your own, caring for your kin, caring for the community. Don't lean on the government too much. kind of do it yourself. Not to say that you can't have community, because it's the community that helps make you who you are, you know, from when you're a child and growing up. But I just mean in terms of, you know, independence and being self-fulfilled. You know, if I can share a quick story with you in terms of kiddos, they keep things real simple. And, you know, when we talk about racism and we talk about identity fracture and identity for children, you know, I had this kiddo, and he sits beside me. Well, you know, Lacey, I'm First Nations. I said, I know. I'm like, me too. Yeah, but do you know what it means to be First Nations? And I said, you know, I think I do, but maybe you could help me. Well, that's my point. Do you know, I've been in care all this time and I don't know what that really means. And so then he shares with me what he's learned from what his worker has shared with him. And, you know, I want to put a big shout out there to a lot of the child protection workers out there. A lot of them do amazing work. And again, great head, great heart, but sometimes the interpretation comes off wrong to the kiddos. And so he shared a few things with me that unfortunately were not true and or were not correct. But at the end of it, one of the things that was a little bit shocking to me was that, you know, for him, when you were to come here, I thought I was going to get to see all of the costumes and feathers. And I said, oh. I said, well, I'm sorry to disappoint you. I said, do you know First Nations people dress just like everybody else too? Well, how come I only get to see them at powwows? And unfortunately, in this kiddo's area, there's not a friendship center. So, and why I say a friendship center is there's 29 friendship centers across Ontario. Here's a few facts I'm just going to throw out there. So there's 29 friendship centers across Ontario. There's 134 First Nations reserves in Ontario as well. And so for this kiddo here, Canada is massive and Ontario is pretty big. And unfortunately, unless this kiddo was to get to a powwow in terms of Indigenous services, there's little, if any. So again, I always want to acknowledge the protection workers that are doing their best to try and help and highlight for kiddos who are First Nations. So by this kiddo being able to look at me, he was able to understand that we don't all wear our regalia. So that was something else I corrected him on. We don't wear costumes, we have regalia. But the other thing is that we dress normal like other people. And so, you know, those were some very soft misconceptions that this kiddo had at the age of 8. And that's really scary because I'm sharing a story with you that's only a few years old.
Wow.
It's only a few years old. And so the identity fracture, racism, systemic racism,
and the whitewashing, right? That's a definitely, like, the whitewashing that happens is just so prevalent.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, for a lot of these kiddos, you know, they believe what they believe. And truthfully, you know, if a child's in care at birth, and pretty much stays in care till after the age of 7, a lot of what they've learned is what they build upon for that next 7 years, which is really hard because what happens for us and what we see is sometimes, you know, and no matter what, we're very thankful that child welfare continues to reach out to our office, but they reach out to us when the kids are at the hospitals and or adoption placements have broken down, which means that we're working with a lot of medically fragile children, broken children who have no self-esteem, lack of confidence, believe they don't have worth or value. And so we really try and build that back up, coupled with sometimes, which I haven't spoken much about, but just to kind of, you know, bring it back to that in terms of residential school and sexual abuse, it's happening today. It's happening in foster care systems. It's happening in group residence systems. And I want to acknowledge, again, child welfare for the leaders who are willing to be brave enough to not only acknowledge it, but tell our office these things, not so we would be punitive, but to really know exactly what the kids need and how to help them. Because it's not about, oh, well, this happened, well, then we need to sue. And no, 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 no. It really has to come back to the child, their voice, their choice, their life situations and cycles. So should they want to bring charges? Well, that's something that, you know what, if they're old enough, we can talk about those things, but we would be very transparent. We would want the workers there. What does all of this look like? You know, but for most kids, and or when those situations happen, they were younger. So their goal isn't about suing, it's about healing.
Yes.
You know, getting the right service at the right time. The hard piece is, again, you know, sometimes children are in care, sometimes children go home, but the harm happened while in care. So how do we massage those things and correct wrongs and make them right? That's kind of, you know, where our office is at, or where we would be at as an advocate office, is again coming back to hearing the child's voice, obviously understanding and knowing what their rights are, but sometimes the right choice doesn't have the best outcome, you know. And really for a lot of our youth, specifically when adoption placement breakdowns occur, or our youth are too much trouble that they're in group residence, human trafficking is another big piece for the girls and the boys that are in the teenage years.
Right. And that is something we didn't get to touch on. And I know for me, in another interview I did, we talked about the corridor and the that kind of runs the 401 from Kitchener to Toronto, being a hot spot for human trafficking, but especially for Indigenous children and youth. And that Indigenous children are often seen as exotic, and so are more sought after. Like this just, I don't know where, I don't even have words for all of this. I don't even have words. But yeah, that's not something we got to touch on much today, but certainly human trafficking is another thing that is close to my heart, just because I can't even imagine what these children and families are going through. But we are running out of time, Lacey. I could talk to you for hours on end. And I do know that there's one other thing that you would like to touch on before we have to call the interview to an end. So if you want to touch on that for us.
So for all your audience members, next Wednesday is Orange Shirt Day. And Orange Shirt Day was really started with a story from a lady named Phyllis Webstat out of BC. And really the story goes with the Orange Shirt Day is that when Phyllis left her reserve, she had a beautiful orange shirt on and she went to residential school. That was taken from her on that day. And she was, you know, put in her place per se. But because of that, in commemorating residential schools, Phyllis had shared that back in 2013. And that really started the movement to say, hey, how do we honor this? And that's what started Orange Shirt Day, was to honor our residential school survivors and let them know that they weren't forgotten, but also to acknowledge the pain and discrimination that those schools imposed on our elders today. So Orange Shirt Day, September 30th, whether you're Native, you're non-Native, please support our residential school survivors, those that have passed. And truthfully, by honoring them, you're also honoring the children today, because again, you know, though our children today are in the system, it doesn't mean that we don't want them to be aware of their own history.
Thank you. Thank you. And so this will be airing next week for the Orange Shirt Day incentive too. And so I just want to say thank you again, Lacey. You are a wealth of knowledge for those of us that are trying to learn and understand and do better. So thank you, thank you, thank you for coming on. As I said, I could talk to you just forever. And I'm so glad that we were introduced to one another, and that you agreed to come on and do this segment with me.
Absolutely. Thank you, Helen.
All right. And for those of you watching, we appreciate it. If you've got questions, please put them in the comment. Like, loves, share this out on your own timeline if this speaks to you. The more people we can share this with, the more people will understand what it is, what racism is all about, and how the structural and systemic racism works, and why it's important for us all now to really get the backstory, the history, listen to the personal stories of others, and just step your ego aside and really listen with an open heart. And that's how change is created. So I thank you all for being here. Thank you, Lacey, once again. And everybody have a great day. Are you there? There we go.